This year might turn out to be one of the most interesting electoral campaigns in history, with Trump getting convicted right before his campaign, Biden performing abysmal during his debates, Trump getting shot, Biden stepping down and Harris taking over, all of which taking place in a turbulent time period. As tensions are rising in the entire world with conflicts in the Ukraine and the Middle East, global warming changing weather patterns, and the trade tensions between China and the US. All the while the US is facing a cost of living crisis and migration is talk of the town. With all that going on, it's an important time to let your voice be heard. But is every vote equal? And does your vote even matter? Time for long story short about the US voting system, its flaws and its alternatives. First we'll go back to where it all began. Before the US became independent, it had a varied system of local government based on English law. Voting was generally limited to white male landowners. Each colony had its own voting regulations and elections were often reserved for local councils and representatives. The Revolutionary War and Declaration of Independence in 1776 brought new ideas of representation and government, rejecting aristocracy and monarchy. The founding generation wanted a political system based on consent of the governed, a radical departure from most European models. This, however, wasn't an easy job. The founding fathers were tasked with creating a government that balanced state and federal power, democracy and various political interests. They drafted the US Constitution. In the Constitution, the system of the Electoral College was developed, reflecting the need to balance between direct popular election and a representative system where states had a significant role. Concerns about regional interests, mistrust of direct democracy and the need to protect smaller states shaped this system. The Electoral College continues to be one of the most controversial elements of the American electoral system. Initially, it was just the property-owning white male that could vote. Women, Native Americans, African Americans and the poor were largely excluded. In this time, the first political parties were developed. Parties nominated candidates and would hold conventions to promote their candidates. The winning party would represent all people in that state. A dubious clause in that time was the 3/5 clause, meaning an enslaved person would count as 3/5 of a person, giving the sovereign slave-owning states a large population and more representatives, even winning them some elections. In 1800, the first peaceful transfer of power between political parties took place, with the election of Thomas Jefferson, establishing a precedent for electoral legitimacy and democratic transition. Between the 1820s and the 1860s was an important period, as voting rights expanded to all white men, not just those who owned land. By the 1830s, the Democratic and Whig parties dominated US politics, solidifying the two-party system that remains in place today. As the Civil War tore through the states, it brought changes to the suffrage. The 15th Amendment was passed by Congress in 1870, allowing men of color the right to vote. However, it didn't go as freely as it seems. Throughout America, there were different methods effectively preventing African Americans from voting, like poll taxes, literacy tests, and even violence. These laws will be known as the Jim Crow laws, which disenfranchised black voters for nearly a century. This wasn't the only negative development. There was widespread political corruption with ex-light vote buying. Luckily, it wasn't all bad, as women activists demanded the right to vote and eventually gained women's suffrage in 1920. In 1965, the Voting Rights Act was passed. It finally banned the literacy tests and other discriminatory practices and gave the federal government oversight in states with a history of voter suppression. The law led to a dramatic increase in black voter registration in the South. Not short after, the 26th Amendment was passed, lowering the voting age from 21 to 18. This was a response to young men being drafted to fight in the Vietnam War, even though they couldn't vote. With the passing of this amendment, we can speak of a modern electoral system where every adult can vote. Even though that's come a long way, there are still some criticisms. First and foremost, the Electoral College system has faced growing critiques, but also issues with gerrymandering and the relative low voting turnout seem to turn some heads. But why are these problems occurring? It can be mostly related to the Electoral College. But what is the Electoral College? The Electoral College is a group of people in every state that selects president and vice president. Every state gets a certain amount of electors based on the number of inhabitants, and every state gets 2 senators. In the mostly two-party system of the US, it is a race to get the majority of the electors cementing you to win. In the system, there's a winner-takes-all philosophy. The biggest party in the state gets all the votes of that state. In this system, it's possible for a party to win an election even though they don't have the most votes nationwide. This happened 5 times before in US history and twice in more recent history, namely the 2000 Bush Jr. election where Al Gore had most votes, and of course the 2016 Trump election where Hillary Clinton had almost 3 million more votes than Trump. This by definition doesn't have to be a problem. However, there are a few flaws to the electoral system. First off, for most states it's already set in stone who's gonna win their election. Where most rural areas will vote for the Republican Party, the urban areas mostly vote for the Democratic Party, meaning that if you are a Republican in say California, it has little use to vote as there's a high probability that state will vote Democratic. This explains that a lot of people don't even care to vote, as their vote doesn't truly count. Secondly, there's a problem that not every vote is equal. That is, due to the 2 senators that every state receives no matter their population. Meaning that if you live in a state with a lot of population, you have to share the 2 senators with the rest of the population in that state. Whereas if you live in a less densely populated area, you'll share the 2 senators with fewer people, increasing the value of your vote, making Texas the most underrepresented state and Wyoming the most overrepresented state in Congress. A vote in Wyoming is 4 times more valuable than a vote in Texas. Due to these reasons, the Electoral College has faced growing criticisms for being unfair because it allows a candidate to win a presidency without winning the popular vote. Many argue that switching to a direct popular vote would be more fair and a better representation of the will of the people. Over the years, members of Congress have tried several times to change the system to popular vote, with one major attempt passing the House in 1969. However, the proposal was blocked in the Senate, where smaller states often opposed changes that could reduce their influence in presidential elections. If there would be a change of system, the question could arise whether a popular vote is the most effective system, as there are multiple other systems throughout the world being put to practice. For example, in most of Europe, the population chooses a party which represents them. Seats are allocated to parties based on proportion of votes they receive. Parties then fill the seats with candidates from their list and try to represent their voters. There are also other practices, like in the Australian Senate elections, where voters rank candidates in order of preference. If a candidate exceeds the quota, their excess votes are transferred to other candidates based on voters' second preferences, making sure your vote doesn't go to waste. If no candidate reaches the quota, the candidate with the fewest votes is eliminated, and their votes are transferred. However, every voting system and every way of counting votes has its own flaws and can be deemed unfair. In every system there will be people benefiting from it and try to uphold it. For us, it's important to know who are those that benefit from it and who will benefit from another system. For now, it seems that the upcoming years this Electoral College system will remain. The only way to make sure your voice is heard is going to the polls and casting your vote. For now, this has been Long Story Short about the US voting system. Make sure to vote, and I'd love to see you in the next episode of Long Story Short.